It's a thought that chills the bones. Even 80 years later, what if the most celebrated day of liberation in modern history, June 6, 1944, had become the day the world lost its final chance at freedom? Most of us grow up believing that D-Day was a heroic inevitability, the moment when good triumphed over evil, when the tide of war finally turned. But history is rarely that neat. In reality, success on that cold, gray morning in Normandy balanced on the thinnest thread imaginable. A single gust of wind, a delayed signal, a German general waking an hour earlier. Any one of those could have changed everything. Imagine that. Instead of beaches secured by Allied troops, imagine chaos, shattered ships, and a channel red with failure. Would we be living in a world speaking German as the language of empire today? Or would the atomic bomb have found its first victims not in Asia, but in the heart of Europe? The scene on June 6th looked almost biblical. Thousands of landing craft crawled toward the French coast, each packed with young men carrying everything they owned for the next few hours of life: rifle, helmet, and the nervous promise that they were part of something bigger than themselves. The air smelled of oil and salt, mixed with the strange sweetness of adrenaline. Overhead, waves of bombers filled the sky like flocks of dark birds. They called it Operation Overlord, but for the men inside those metal boxes, it felt more like Operation Overwhelmed. Many of them vomited from fear before the ramp even dropped. And yet, history tells us they made it through. But what if they hadn't? What if those bunkers carved into the cliffs of Normandy held fast? What if the German panzer divisions had rolled in before the Allies could establish their fragile beachhead? That's where the nightmare begins. Because D-Day wasn't just a battle. It was the hinge on which the entire 20th century turned. If it failed, the Soviet Red Army, grinding forward in the east, might have been left to fight Hitler alone. The Western Allies, Britain, Canada, and the United States, would have faced a moral and logistical collapse. Roosevelt's re-election hopes could have evaporated overnight. And imagine Winston Churchill, the man who promised victory at all costs, forced to explain to a mourning Britain why the greatest invasion in history had ended in ruin. The political fallout would have been catastrophic. Allied unity could have cracked. Peace talks might have been considered not because of hope, but because of exhaustion. Now picture the German side. Hitler had spent months fortifying his Atlantic Wall, an enormous chain of defenses stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. He was paranoid yet meticulous. Concrete bunkers, artillery nests, and minefields were laid out with obsessive precision. If D-Day had failed, it would have validated his vision of Fortress Europe. Goebbels' propaganda machine would have erupted in triumph. The 1,000-year Reich repels the Allied invasion. German morale, which by mid-1944 had begun to fray, would have surged. Factories would have redoubled production. And perhaps most dangerously, occupied Europe might have lost faith in liberation. The resistance movements in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, already risking everything, would have been crushed under despair. A failed D-Day would not just mean dead soldiers, it would mean dead hope. Think about how that echoes today. We like to imagine that progress is unstoppable, that freedom always wins in the end. But history warns otherwise. The victory of June 6th was not destiny. It was the result of unimaginable risk. The Allied commanders debated postponing the landing because of a brewing storm in the English Channel. Eisenhower himself wrote 2 speeches, one for success and one for failure.
In the second, never needed, he took full responsibility for a catastrophe that almost happened. That draft still exists in the Eisenhower Presidential Library, a ghostly reminder that even heroes prepare for defeat. When you read it, you can almost feel the weight of a man who knew that millions of lives and the moral future of humanity rested on the weather and luck. If the storm had worsened, the landing craft might never have reached shore. The paratroopers could have scattered miles from their targets. German artillery, hidden behind the dunes, might have turned the invasion fleet into floating coffins. In our alternate timeline, the beaches would have become graveyards. Newsreels back home would show not victory, but disaster. American mothers would watch the flickering screens in horror, realizing their sons died not for triumph, but for an impossible gamble. And the world's faith in Allied supremacy, the idea that democracy was stronger than tyranny, could have shattered overnight. The idea of freedom itself would have gone into hiding. The image that binds this alternate world together is the sand. The sand of Normandy that, in our history, drank the blood of heroes and birthed victory. In the other version, that same sand buries everything. Dreams, plans, nations. The grains of sand don't care who wins. They just keep shifting with the wind, indifferent to glory or defeat. That's the haunting part. Because the story of D-Day isn't about certainty, it's about fragility. The line between triumph and disaster was no wider than a rifle barrel. And yet, here's the paradox. Even in this imagined failure, the essence of D-Day remains. The courage, the defiance, the belief that ordinary men could storm the gates of tyranny, all that would still shine through the smoke. Maybe that's the real reason we still talk about D-Day today. It's not because it guarantees victory, it's because it reminds us that victory is never guaranteed. It must be fought for again and again in every generation that takes freedom for granted. The tide of history could have turned differently that morning, but the will to resist, that unshakable human spark, would have remained. And that spark will lead us deeper into the heart of the story, into the fortress Hitler built and the storm the Allies dared to face.
By 1944, Europe had become less a continent than a cage. Its steel bars, forged by fear, propaganda, and the sheer mechanical precision of Nazi engineering. To understand what D-Day truly risked, one must first step inside the fortress Hitler built. They called it Festung Europa, Fortress Europe. And to the German mind, it wasn't just a military concept, it was theology. A world remade in concrete, ideology, and paranoia. Picture it. Thousands of miles of coastline transformed into a labyrinth of death. From the fjords of Norway to the beaches of Spain, every inlet bristled with mines. Every dune hid a bunker, and every cliff held the promise of artillery fire that could tear a battleship in half. And at its heart, sitting in his Alpine retreat, was Adolf Hitler, a man convinced that destiny itself had granted him one final test. In those months leading up to June 1944, Hitler's generals still believed they could bleed the Allies dry before they ever reached German soil. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the desert fox turned guardian of the Atlantic coast, walked the beaches of Normandy like a man obsessed. He had once outmaneuvered the British across North Africa, but now his war had narrowed to sand and concrete. He watched engineers pour miles of steel hedgehogs, angular obstacles meant to rip apart landing craft. He ordered mines buried by the millions,
even tying them to wooden stakes so rising tides would trigger instant explosions. He knew air superiority was lost, but he believed he could weaponize geography itself. His theory was chillingly simple: stop the Allies on the beach or lose the war. There would be no second chance. German intelligence, despite its reputation, had grown sluggish by 1944. Deception operations by the Allies, like Operation Fortitude, which used fake radio signals, inflatable tanks, and even a double agent feeding lies directly to Berlin, convinced the High Command that the invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. Yet the strength of Fortress Europe didn't rely on knowing where the attack would land. It relied on what would happen once it did. Every coastal town was transformed into a miniature Alamo. Every hilltop bristled with machine guns that could mow down entire battalions in seconds. The German army, though stretched thin, remained the most efficient killing machine on Earth. It wasn't just men and metal, it was ideology. Soldiers were taught not merely to defend territory, but to embody the myth of the unbreakable Reich. For civilians across occupied Europe, Fortress Europe wasn't protection, it was prison. French villagers lived under the hum of Luftwaffe planes and the watchful eyes of SS patrols. Resistance networks whispered through the night, smuggling radio codes, risking torture for fragments of intelligence. In Paris, the Gestapo's shadow fell across every street. Yet beneath that terror, something else pulsed, a quiet countdown. People sensed that the tide was shifting, even if they couldn't yet see the storm gathering across the channel. When Allied planes flew overhead at night, scattering leaflets instead of bombs, they brought more than propaganda. They brought hope. But hope alone wouldn't breach concrete.
Hitler's high command, meanwhile, was fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions. Rommel wanted to confront the invasion at the shore. Others, like Gerd von Rundstedt, believed in a more flexible defense, letting the Allies land and then crushing them inland with armored divisions. The result was chaos disguised as confidence. Hitler himself hoarded decision-making authority, refusing to release panzer divisions without his personal approval. And on the morning of D-Day, when the invasion began, he was asleep. His staff, terrified of waking him, delayed the counterattack for crucial hours. It's one of history's dark ironies. The man obsessed with control slept through the moment he might have changed everything. But in our imagined world, where D-Day fails, perhaps Hitler woke earlier. Perhaps the panzers rolled before dawn, striking the beaches while the sea still churned with helpless soldiers. To grasp what that would mean, imagine Omaha Beach not as the site of courage, but as a slaughterhouse. Imagine tanks cresting the hills, pushing the Allies back into the sea. Rommel's Atlantic Wall would become legend, the proof that Germany could still dictate the fate of continents. In Berlin, Goebbels' voice would thunder through the radio. The invincible Reich repels the invasion. Europe stands united against the Anglo-American plague. It's easy to mock such rhetoric now, but in a world exhausted by war, even lies can sound like salvation. Nations under Nazi rule might have bowed their heads again, resigned to decades of oppression. The psychology of Fortress Europe is what makes it truly terrifying. It wasn't built just to stop bullets. It was built to stop belief. Every bunker was a message. The Reich is eternal. Resistance is futile. In that sense, the Atlantic Wall resembled a medieval castle updated for the 20th century. The Allies weren't merely storming a coastline. They were assaulting a world view, a belief that power, not freedom, defines civilization. And that battle, more than the one with bullets and blood, would decide the century.
Yet, for all its strength, Fortress Europe had one fatal flaw. It mistook faith for fear. The concrete was real, but the conviction holding it together was already crumbling. German soldiers joked bitterly about their concrete coffins. Civilians prayed in secret for the Allies to come. Even Rommel, loyal soldier that he was, began to doubt. He told his wife in a letter that Germany's fate might already be sealed. He wanted to end the war before it destroyed everything. But history, real or imagined, rarely grants mercy to men trapped in machines of their own making. The fortress still stands today, in fragments. Rusted gun turrets buried in sand, bunkers swallowed by grass, relics of an empire that once believed it could defy the tides. Tourists walk among them, snapping photos, unaware that beneath their feet lies the blueprint of a world that almost was. If D-Day had failed, these ruins would not be monuments to defeat, but altars of victory. The world might have learned to live behind walls instead of breaking them. And that brings us closer to the breaking dawn, the moment when the invasion begins to unravel, and the dream of liberation teeters on the edge of collapse.
At dawn, the sea was supposed to glitter with liberation. Instead, it burned. The first wave of landing craft, packed with frightened, seasick men, met not the confusion of a surprised enemy, but the precise choreography of hell. In this alternate warning, the clouds hung low and the tide turned cruel. Allied bombers had missed their targets. Shells meant to shatter bunkers fell harmlessly inland, scattering dust but sparing concrete. The German guns, untouched, opened fire with mechanical fury. Each flash from the cliffs marked another boat erased from existence. The water turned black with oil and red with blood. On the radio channels meant for orders, only static and screams remained. What history calls the longest day became the shortest campaign of the war. Omaha Beach was the first to die. Entire companies vanished before they could even raise their rifles. The beach obstacles, those twisted crosses of steel that Rommel had planted, did their job perfectly. Landing craft exploded against hidden mines. Bodies floated ashore faster than reinforcements could arrive. On Utah, chaos reigned as mist drops scattered paratroopers miles from their targets. Many landed in flooded fields, drowning before their feet even touched solid ground. At Gold and Juneau, the British and Canadian forces fought with gallantry that history would never remember, because there would be no victory to record. Only Sword Beach held for a few desperate hours before German armor thundered through the mist like a storm made of steel. By noon, the beaches were graveyards. By nightfall, they were silent. In this version of events, Eisenhower's handwritten note, the one history knows as the failure message, is not locked away in a museum. It is broadcast to the world. Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed, he reads, his voice trembling but resolute. I have withdrawn the troops. Any blame or fault is mine alone. Across America, people gather around radios in disbelief. Mothers clutch telegrams they feared would come. Roosevelt, grim-faced, cancels his evening address and calls an emergency meeting of the Joint Chiefs. In London, Churchill drinks in silence. He had told his aides that success on D-Day was the only way to shorten the war by a year. Failure would lengthen it by a generation. His cigar burns down to ash, untouched. The German response is immediate and brutal. Rommel, elated yet wary, orders his divisions to press the counterattack before the Allies can regroup. Hitler declares June 6th Tag der Erlösung, Day of Deliverance. Goebbels unleashes a propaganda storm, plastering Europe with posters of broken Allied ships beneath the words, "The sea has rejected them." In Paris, collaborationist leaders toast the miracle of Normandy. In Berlin, bells ring as if for resurrection. Yet beneath the celebration lies something darker, a collective exhale of relief mixed with denial. The Reich has survived the unthinkable, but at what cost? Every soldier knows the Red Army is still advancing from the east, and every officer knows the Reich's resources are bleeding away. Still, the myth of invincibility returns, and that myth is all Hitler ever needed to keep his empire breathing a little longer.
The impact ripples outward. The French resistance, waiting for coded messages that never come, is betrayed by silence. Units rise prematurely and are annihilated by SS patrols. The cities of Caen, Le Havre, and Rouen, which in our timeline became gateways to freedom, become slaughter zones. The Gestapo moves quickly, rounding up anyone suspected of aiding the invasion. Executions multiply, and the roads of Normandy fill with both refugees and the dead. The British press, muzzled by government order, releases only a single line: "The invasion attempt has been repelled." It's not a headline, it's an obituary. Across the Atlantic, America faces a reckoning. Congress erupts in fury over the losses. Newspapers that once printed maps of the road to Berlin now print casualty lists that stretch across entire pages. Roosevelt's political enemies seize their moment, calling the invasion reckless, arrogant, and doomed. The public, exhausted by years of war rationing and grief, begins to fracture. Isolationist voices rise again. Why die for Europe's freedom when Europe itself seems cursed to fall? In factories, production slows, morale plummets. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the war feels unwinnable. The arsenal of democracy begins to rust from within. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin reads the headlines and smiles without joy. The failure of D-Day means the Soviet Union must now bear the full weight of defeating Hitler alone. It's a bitter triumph, one that feeds his paranoia and his resolve. He orders a massive new offensive, Operation Bagration, launched months early at horrific cost. The Red Army marches west through fire and ice, swallowing cities but losing men faster than bullets can be made. To Stalin, the Western Allies are cowards who let others bleed for their mistakes. To Hitler, they are proof that destiny favors the Reich. To history, they are ghosts of what might have been. The symbolism of that broken dawn lingers. In the real world, D-Day was a sunrise, the rebirth of hope. In this one, it is the eclipse of it. The beaches of Normandy become sacred ground for a different reason, not because freedom was born there, but because it died there. Veterans who survived speak in hushed tones, haunted by the memory of waves that carried away friends like driftwood. Photographers capture images so horrific that censors ban them from publication. And yet, beneath the mourning, something dangerous stirs. A hunger for revenge, an obsession with finding another way to end the war, whatever the cost. That hunger will lead to decisions darker than any made before, because when democracies lose their faith, they reach for terrible tools. The failure of D-Day doesn't end the war, it twists it. Scientists in secret labs work faster. The Manhattan Project accelerates, now driven not by fear of Germany building the bomb first, but by the grim determination to end a nightmare no army could storm away. If the beaches of Normandy became the Allies' grave, then the laboratories of Los Alamos may yet become their vengeance. And as Europe drowns in its own blood, a new question rises from the ashes of the invasion. If the world cannot be saved by courage, will it try to be saved by fire?
By the winter of 1945, the map of Europe looked like a wound that refused to heal. With D-Day shattered, the Western Front never opened, and Hitler's black banners still hung over Paris, Brussels, and Warsaw. The Reich had survived the impossible storm, and survival gave birth to delusion. Hitler, frail yet electrified by vindication, declared that Providence had confirmed his destiny. In our world, he would spend his last days in a bunker. In this one, he rules from the ruins of Berlin, the heart of a continent frozen in fear. The Iron Cross, once pinned on his soldiers' chests, now hangs metaphorically over Europe itself, pressing down with the weight of a nightmare that refuses to end. America, heartbroken and humiliated, retreats into itself. Roosevelt dies still haunted by the loss of Normandy, and his successor, without a victory to unite the nation, faces an angry, divided America. Isolationism blooms again like mold in a forgotten room. Congress slashes foreign aid, and the promise of a united nations never leaves paper. Across the Atlantic, Churchill's government collapses under protest. Britain, exhausted, negotiates an uneasy armistice. The headlines read, "Peace without victory," but in truth it is surrender without dignity. British troops withdraw from the continent, and a curtain, not of iron, but of concrete, descends across the Channel. The fortress Europe Rommel built has become reality. Inside that fortress, life becomes something between theater and prison. In France, collaboration becomes survival. The Vichy regime is reborn as the French protectorate, its tricolor flag now stamped with the Iron Cross. Schools teach European unity under German leadership. French children memorize lines from Mein Kampf as if it were scripture. Paris becomes both beautiful and dead, a museum city preserved as Hitler's trophy. The cafes stay open, the music still plays, but the laughter has a hollow echo. People smile without teeth. The same happens across the continent. The Netherlands rebranded as a Germanic cousin, Scandinavia as a northern frontier, and Italy reduced to a junior partner in tyranny. Only Switzerland remains nominally free, a neutral island surrounded by silence. In the East, the war continues in a way the West can no longer comprehend. The Red Army, deprived of an Allied front to divide German forces, faces annihilation. The Wehrmacht turns its full attention eastward, launching Operation Iron Hammer, a campaign of unrelenting brutality. Cities like Minsk, Kiev, and Leningrad fall one by one, their populations starved or deported. The dream of liberation that once fueled Soviet propaganda dies in frozen trenches. Stalin, cornered and furious, retreats beyond the Urals, transforming what remains of his empire into a paranoid military fortress. He vows to fight until the last Russian breathes, but the momentum is gone. By 1946, Moscow is under siege. By 1947, the swastika flies over the Kremlin. The Reich has done what Napoleon and centuries of winter could not. But victory poisons itself. The very machinery that built Hitler's empire begins to corrode under the weight of its own perfection. With no external enemies left to blame, the Reich turns inward. The Gestapo expands its reach, devouring not just dissenters, but the merely insufficiently enthusiastic.
Scientists who once dreamed of rockets and jet engines now build weapons that never see battle, as bureaucrats demand miracles to justify their survival. The same scientists who, in our timeline, would take humanity to the moon are here trapped in laboratories, producing weapons to keep a terrified world obedient. Technology advances, but toward darkness, not stars. The first V-3 rockets cross the Atlantic, striking New York and Washington not as invasions, but as reminders. Each explosion says the same thing: stay out. In this world, the United States becomes a fortress of its own, a superpower turned recluse. Its navy patrols the Atlantic like a ghost fleet, guarding a peace no one believes in. The Statue of Liberty still stands, but across the harbor rises something new. Massive anti-aircraft towers, radar domes, a skyline of vigilance. Freedom becomes a slogan printed on ration books, not a living ideal. The dream that once fueled the greatest generation curdles into paranoia. America is safe, but it is no longer free. Meanwhile, across the world, the Axis powers divide the spoils. Japan, never bombed by the atomic fire that in our timeline ended its empire, rules a brutal dominion from China to the Pacific. The world becomes a balance of empires, not ideologies. The 20th century, once imagined as the age of democracy, becomes the age of control. History in this world no longer advances, it circulates, like blood trapped in a dying heart. The radio replaces freedom with obedience, the newspaper with silence. People stop asking questions not because they are forbidden, but because they no longer remember how. And yet, even in this bleak dominion, resistance refuses to vanish completely. In the shadows of ruined cities, whispers persist. In Paris, a cell of forgotten writers meet by candlelight, preserving banned books. In Poland, farmers hide Jewish children decades after the Reich declared them extinct. In the forests of Ukraine, partisans still strike at railways, ghosts of a war that refuses to end. Even among the German youth, cracks form. The sons of victors grow restless. They see the world their fathers built, efficient, obedient, soulless, and they ask the forbidden question: was this victory worth it? The image that defines this alternate future is the Iron Cross. Once a medal of valor, now a symbol of suffocation. It hangs over every doorway, every textbook, every citizen's heart. It gleams on the uniforms of police who no longer know what they protect. It is both shield and shackle, beauty and burden. And like all symbols built on fear, it carries the seed of its own destruction. Because beneath that iron weight, humanity still breathes. The same stubborn spark that once landed on the beaches of Normandy still flickers somewhere in the dark. Perhaps it hides in a prison cell. Perhaps it hums in a scientist's lab, where a new kind of fire waits to be born. That fire will not come from courage or unity, but from desperation. And when it ignites, it will change not just Europe, but the world itself.
In the world where D-Day failed, time itself seems haunted. Decades pass, but the sky never quite brightens. Europe remains divided not by ideology, but by exhaustion. Its people bound to a peace built on fear. The year is 1962. Hitler is long dead. His body cremated in the Reich's chancellery, his ashes scattered like lies.
But his world survives him. A continent of obedience, uniformed and gray, breathes in unison beneath banners that have faded from crimson to rust. Children no longer salute, they simply comply. Art has become propaganda, history a fairy tale, and faith a museum exhibit. The great Nazi empire, swollen with its own victories, finally begins to rot from within. And in that slow decay, humanity begins to stir again. In this version of history, freedom does not explode. It whispers. It takes the form of a young German woman who finds a forbidden book hidden in her grandfather's attic, the Diary of Anne Frank. It takes the form of an American pilot who defects from isolationist America to smuggle refugees out of Europe. It appears in Paris when a saxophone player, tired of playing state-approved marches, begins to play jazz in secret clubs under the catacombs. These are the new beaches, the silent landings. The tide of defiance returns not with armies, but with ideas. In every regime built on control, the first, rebellion, is imagination. The second is memory. By the late 1960s, the Reich's grip weakens. Economic stagnation, corruption, and a generation born after victory begin to erode the myth of invincibility. The youth question the old men in uniforms who talk of destiny and sacrifice. Some spray graffiti on walls that read, "Wir erinnern uns an den Morgen." We remember the morning. They mean June 6, 1944. The day the world almost changed. Even in defeat, the story of D-Day becomes underground scripture. Copies of forbidden Allied photographs circulate like relics. People stare at them not as propaganda, but as promises. The image of a soldier wading ashore becomes a symbol of something no empire can kill, the will to begin again. In America, the guilt never fades. Veterans who survived the failed invasion age into silence. Some call for re-engagement, others for peace at any cost. The nuclear arsenal grows until the earth itself trembles beneath it. When the first atomic test vaporizes a section of desert larger than a city, the generals call it insurance. But a few scientists whisper what it really is: atonement. The Manhattan Project, never halted, becomes an obsession to reclaim what courage lost. By 1950, the United States holds the power to annihilate continents, but not the moral clarity to use it. So they wait. The bomb becomes the new D-Day, a weapon that promises liberation through fire, redemption through fear. And then, in 1954, history takes its final twist. A massive explosion shatters Berlin, not from invasion, but rebellion. A German nuclear facility, sabotaged from within, detonates in a blast that vaporizes the Reich's capital. No one ever claims responsibility. Some say it was the Americans, some say the Soviets. But the truth, whispered decades later, tells a simpler story. It was Germans themselves. Scientists, soldiers, and mothers who decided that a world without freedom was not worth saving. The Iron Cross melted that night, both literally and symbolically. The war that never truly ended finally consumed itself. Europe became ashes again, but this time the ashes gave birth to something different: regret, and the faintest hint of redemption. In the decades that follow, survivors rebuild. The flags are gone, the statues crumble. New nations rise not on conquest, but confession. The word democracy returns to the world's vocabulary, hesitant at first, then louder. The United States, once paralyzed by shame, becomes its awkward guardian again. Yet the memory of that failed dawn never disappears. It hangs over every treaty, every speech about peace, every photograph of soldiers in foreign lands. Because even in this altered history, where the Allies lost and tyranny reigned, the echo of D-Day remains, the moral gravity of the modern age. It reminds the living what happens when courage falters, when freedom hesitates, when humanity bets on safety instead of principle. That's why D-Day still defines us, even now, even here in our own imperfect world. Because the question, what if it had failed, is really a mirror held up to our present. What happens when we take democracy for granted? When comfort replaces conviction? When the tides of apathy rise higher than the tides of courage? The beaches of Normandy may lie far behind us, but the fight they represent is eternal. Every generation faces its own invasion, against ignorance, against indifference, against the slow decay of truth. Today, as people scroll through screens instead of history books, as nations flirt once again with authoritarian temptation, the ghosts of D-Day whisper louder. They remind us that freedom isn't inherited, it's maintained. Not through monuments, but through vigilance. Not through flags, but through empathy. The men who stormed the beaches did not die for certainty. They died for the chance to choose. That chance is fragile. It can fail. It almost did. And that is the real legacy of that imagined broken dawn. Whether D-Day succeeded or failed, its meaning is the same. Freedom demands the impossible and forgives nothing. We stand today not because destiny favored us, but because millions of ordinary people refused to let the world be ruled by fear. Their victory or their loss still defines our moral universe. So, if this story unsettled you, it should. History is not comfort. It's a warning. The tides will rise again, in one form or another. When they do, the question will return, whispered by the ghosts of Normandy. Would we still have the courage to land? If you believe their story should never fade, if you think history still matters in a world that scrolls too fast to remember, then share this story. Subscribe, not for me, but for them. Because freedom, like memory, only survives when we keep telling it.